Eat, sleep, bet, repeat. That's how we're getting down on the opening line at EliteSportsBetting.com. I'll be your host, Benny Ricciardi, and today I asked my man Armando Marsal to hop on with me, talk a little bit of football, because we had some big news yesterday. But before we get into that, Armando, what's going on, bro?
Nothing much, man. With this draft guide, keeping busy, pumping out content every single day. Wrote a pretty cool article yesterday about drafting quarterbacks early and different ways your roster can look if you avoid some of these early quarterbacks such as Mahomes and Lamar Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
I found that to be pretty cool, man, because it did provide some perspective as to how different your roster can actually look without having to draft an early round quarterback.
Yeah, and it's kind of been the way I've been a big proponent of the, later round QBs for a long time. And it's been the way I've been drafting too. There's some really good quarterbacks that are still going to be sitting on the board around 9, 10 rounds, somewhere in there,
Yeah.
which is usually where I'm going after them. And, we have seen in the past, for those of you who like numbers, that the win percentage of people who wait till round 9, 10, or 11 to draft those quarterbacks tends to be higher than the average win percentage if you just randomly roll the dice right there. So it is something that has proven to be a way that you can give yourself a little bit of a leg up. But speaking of legs up or legs down or however the hell we want to talk about this, some big news came out yesterday, which is actually why I asked Armando to hop on here, because I wanted to kind of discuss this. So let's start right away with the big news. Dalvin Cook saying he's going to sit out if he doesn't get some kind of new contract or extension or anything like that. Initial reaction from you on that. Go ahead.
We see this every year now where there's a running back or just a player in general saying they're not going to, play, they're not going to report until a contract is made. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it doesn't. We saw, both spectrums when Ezekiel Elliott, he did this. It worked out. They signed him, And then you have Le'Veon Bell. He held out. He sat out. He didn't play. We saw with Melvin Gordon last year. He held out, 4 weeks, I think it was, and then he finally decided to come play. Look, right now, I think it's way too early to tell what's going to happen here. This is a situation obviously worth monitoring, but I'm not going to let Dalvin Cook slide too much in my board right now, at least. But what I am going to do is if I'm drafting Dalvin Cook, I'm 100% investing in Alexander Mattison, even if it's a round or two ahead of his ADP. You and I were talking about this before. He had an 11th round ADP. You told me that he went in the 9th round in the draft you were doing yesterday. Similar thing. One of our subs and I were talking in the chat yesterday, and he told me the same thing. He drafted him in the 9th round. I'm totally fine with taking him a round or two ahead of ADP. And if you see he's going in the 9th, don't hesitate to take him in the 8th, especially if you own Dalvin Cook, because Madison proved last year that if he's given the opportunity, he could produce, RB low-end RB1 numbers, high-end RB2 numbers on a week-to-week basis, given a full workload. So if Cook is out, if he sits out, or he gets injured, he is injury-prone. I think Madison is probably the top handcuff in the NFL right now.
I mean, I already considered Madison to be one of the top handcuffs that I was actually looking at after you get through that first wave of, the guys that you really want to have on your team. You mentioned quite a few things in there, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that I have in the outline here. So let's kind of go one by one through them and kind of give people an idea of what to look at here. So if you stop looking as of 2 days ago, Dalvin Cook was going in an average ADP of 4.7. All right, so basically after, Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott, Dalvin Cook was the next most drafted guy, followed by like Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, Derrick Henry, the guys in that range right there. But he was basically the 4th guy coming off the board in most drafts. The draft I was in last night, he went 9th. The draft that our sub was talking about, he went 7th. So now you're talking about him dropping from that first tier of running backs behind the guys that I just mentioned there, like the Derrick Henrys, the Alvin Kamaras, basically the Michael Thomases as well, which is kind of how the top of most first rounds of the draft that I've been in, at least, have kind of gone this year. What are your thoughts on Cook dropping behind guys like Henry and Thomas and Kamara? And do you think he still deserves to be ahead of guys like Mixon and Drake and Sanders, who are kind of going right after him in there?
I'd be taking Cook, and that this hasn't changed for me. at 6. I think that's the right spot for him. 6'7". I wouldn't mind taking someone like Nick Chubb ahead of him right now. I'm a big Nick Chubb fan myself, though, so I might be a little bit biased there. But I'm still taking Kamara over Dalvin Cook. I was taking Kamara over Dalvin Cook even before this. Michael Thomas was where I was kind of, whether I take a running back or receiver. I lean Michael Thomas right now, even more so because of the situation. But I'm not going to take Derrick Henry. I'm not going to take Joe Mixon ahead of Dalvin Cook right this second. I mean, like I said, it's way too early. We know the upside that's there with Dalvin Cook if he plays. I like to look at these things in a hopeful situation. Now, if we're talking late July and I'm doing a best ball and it doesn't look like it's gotten any better, even August, now we're talking a different situation. But we're still in June. Still a ton of time, between now and the start of the season. And this is a young running back who's flashed a ton of potential. I think, the Vikings might get something done, and maybe both sides agree. I'm hopeful for that. But right now, it's not changing much, man. I keep drafting him between 6 and 7 is where I'm, be totally fine with drafting him.
All right, so let's go to the other side of that same coin then. We talked about Alexander Mattison. ADP 121, 118, somewhere in that range over the course of 121 to 125, somewhere in that range over the course of drafts leading up to 2 days ago. In the last 2 days, we've seen that ADP jump from the 120s all the way down to 117 already. And that's really with only about a day of this Dalvin Cook news out there. You mentioned that he went in the 9th round of a draft you were talking about with one of our subs. He also went at the middle of the 9th round in a draft that I was in as well. It was a 12-teamer. So you're looking at him being somewhere around, like pick 100 now. So jumping up a little bit there. Yeah. Again, how high Madison goes is you're going to see somebody draft this guy at 50 right now because they're thinking that Dalvin Cook's going to be out. You probably won't see him drop as low as he had been at the ADP around 120 or so. But I think Armando kind of made a good point here is that the closer it gets to the season and the less clarity we have on this situation, the higher you're going to see Alexander Mattison move up the charts here. And I think that is probably the way it's going to go. So let me ask you this right now. If you're drafting today, you're still thinking Cook, they get something done, and it's not a big deal. You're still drafting Cook there. So does that change your Alexander Mattison, love at all? Like, does this push him up against a couple of the other second-tier guys that you were comparing him to? Does it really not change much for you? Does it move the needle at all at this point in time?
I think it does. I definitely think it does because, he still comes at a value right now. And then when you look at the running backs, like yesterday he was drafted with the second pick in that draft that we were talking about, the second pick of the 9th round. All right. So we're already talking probably a, 2 round difference just with this news. I think we're going to see, like you mentioned, there's going to be someone that takes him somewhere in the 5th, 6th round in some drafts. It's going to happen. Now, I'm looking at some of the running backs that went in the 7th round, Sony Michel, Duke Johnson, Matt Breida, Ronald Jones, Marlon Mack. Like, these are guys that I would not hesitate taking Madison over if he's going to, get the start. So if I'm looking for upside, there, I'd definitely be taking chances on him in the 7th, 8th round. I do think that's a little early if it ends up being that Cook works out the deal here. But you're going to have to, if you really want Madison, you're going to have to kind of look into those rounds because if he's already starting to go early in the 9th round, give it a couple days, give it a couple of weeks, and you're going to see where he's going to start being drafted in the 7th round regularly. So right now, if you're drafting, take advantage of that ADP. Don't wait to the 9th or end of the 9th or beginning of the 10th. Just, if you're in that 9th, end of the 8th, just go ahead and do it, And if you own Cook, I honestly would not hesitate drafting someone like Madison in the 7th round right away because his ADP is only going to start climbing until we get news here.
Yeah, if you're talking the second pick of the 9th round, 8 times 12 is 80, 96 plus
96.
2, so 98. So we're talking about him already cracking into the top 100 of draft picks just with the news coming out yesterday and drafts that went on last night. You also mentioned a couple of the guys who have done this whole sit-out thing before. And I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to go back over that a little bit because especially last year, we had two big ones last year. So at certain points last year, Ezekiel Elliott dropped to the 8th, the ninth, the 10th, the 11th pick in the first round, to the point where I actually had a team in the play draft best ball last year where I had Ezekiel Elliott as my 10th pick, I think, or 11th pick overall in the draft. I then was able to come and get Dalvin Cook on the way back last year. I could see a similar thing happening with Dalvin Cook here. You know, again, yesterday, just in one day of this news, he dropped from being a guy that was going like fourth, fifth, sixth in every draft to a guy that was going 7, 8, 9. Now, if you can get a guy like Dalvin Cook at the turn in the first round, and then come back and grab a Mixon or a Chubb or whichever one of those other guys kind of drops right there, that's going to be a hell of a way to start off a draft if you're able to do that this year. And like I said, we weren't able to do that last year. You know, last year with Zeke in this exact same situation, we watched Zeke drop from a guy who was just like Cook, third or fourth overall in every one of those drafts, and we saw him drop to the end of the first round. And then to go along with that, we also saw his backup, who was he last year? Tony Pollard. We saw Tony Pollard start getting drafted in round 5 and round 6 because people were really thinking that Zeke was going to be out. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen here. I'm just kind of giving you guys a historical perspective on what happened with, this kind of situation in the past. Remember, Le'Veon Bell sat out, but nobody really thought Le'Veon Bell wasn't going to wind up playing. So his ADP didn't really fall. He was still a big first rounder. I think Le'Veon Bell sitting out most of that year for the Steelers is what really has people kind of worried right now. And if you're doing these early drafts, I mean, best ball drafts have started. Some of the NFFC and FFPC and all those drafts have started already. There is a lot of upside if you're willing to roll the dice on a guy like Madison right now. There's also a lot of upside if you're willing to have the balls of steel and draft a guy like Zeke was last year or like Dalvin Cook is this year, knowing that you're getting him at a good value. When does that point in time kind of switch for you, Armando? Like, when does it go from, yeah, I'm not worried, I'm still going Dalvin Cook, to, holy cow, I really have to start thinking about this because I'm sitting on 40% Cook in my best balls, and I might have 40% dead teams before the season even starts?
I'd probably say late July, early August. Once we start getting closer, to the season, I'll start being a little bit more, I guess, reserved when it comes to him, and maybe not take as many stabs. Fortunately, I haven't been in a pick yet where I've had the opportunity to choose Cook.
Okay.
But what I would say is I'm not going to be overreactive with this type of news in June. I know that there's been, fantasy owners have been burned. You mentioned Le'Veon Bell. That season, he was a top 2, 3 pick pretty much right up to the season started. So he did burn a lot of fantasy owners, and I know that. The good thing here about Cook, and this is why, and I don't want to be redundant, but the good thing about Cook is you can take that chance and you can handcuff him with someone that is going to pretty much work as an every down back if Cook does sit out. We didn't have that with Bell at the time. James Conner was the guy that kind of was going to be the handcuff and whatnot. And I remember this clearly because my brother-in-law, he's in my draft, and he mentioned to me, I take Bell. What do you think? I told him, you should handcuff him with James Conner. That was my advice to him. He ended up doing so. That's when Conner blew up, and it worked out for him. It didn't burn him that much. But you have that luxury here with Dalvin Cook. You had that luxury with Ezekiel Elliott, so that at this time I wouldn't be overreactive to the news. I would, continue to draft Cook in that first round where he was going, maybe drop a couple picks if you feel more comfortable taking Joe Mixon or Derrick Henry ahead of him because you're getting, someone that's for sure going to play. I get it. I'm not going to do that. But if I'm drafting Cook, I am 1,000% prioritizing Alexander Madison. I would do so anyways, but even more so now. I mean, I think if you draft Cook, you have to have that mentality. I'm going to exhaust a 6th, 7th, or 8th round pick on someone like Alexander Madison, really depending on where you are in the draft.
Now, thinking about how high Alexander Madison can possibly wind up going in drafts if we do get news that Dalvin Cook is not going to play or not going to play. I think the example that we can look at, the most recent example from last year that kind of paints a good picture of this is the Austin Eckler situation. So, last year the Chargers had Melvin Gordon as their lead back. Austin Eckler was, kind of like the receiving back, I guess, a couple of years ago. And that was the way everybody thought they were going to go into last season. All of a sudden, Gordon decides he's going to hold out again. Eckler starts going in, jumped up from like a 7th, 8th round pick, like kind of around where Madison was going, maybe a little bit ahead because of his PPR skills. He starts jumping up into the 4th or 5th round. I remember Scott Fishbowl draft, when the Melvin Gordon news dropped, I was sitting there with like a 5th round pick looking for a running back. Was looking at the other names still on the board at the time, and I was like, well, if this Melvin Gordon thing's going to work out, Austin Eckler in the 4th, 5th round is going to be a pretty good value. By the end of draft season, Armando, this was a guy who was going as high as the 3rd round.
Mm-hmm.
Is that basically the ceiling that we could look at here for Madison if we start getting news, or if the news starts getting worse and worse and it looks like Cook's going to sit out? Is Alexander Madison somebody who can hop up into the 3rd round? And if so, shouldn't we be trying to grab those shares of 7th round Alexander Madison or 8th round Alexander Madison now? Because if he becomes 3rd round Madison, those teams are going to be ridiculous.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's where he'd be going if we have news in August, in late July, early August, that Cook is not going to play. He's sitting out. Madison's going to just skyrocket, in these draft boards. So yeah, 100%. I expect that, just like an Eckler situation. And starting drafts, the drafts I'm doing now are all past the 9th round, so I have no shot. But any draft coming up, I'm gonna be targeting Alexander Madison in that 7th, 8th round. Just for the upside.
Slow drafts, especially if you're sitting in a slow draft right now with this news that dropped and nobody's taken him yet. If there was only 1 or 2 picks yesterday and guys are asleep at the wheel, how do you pass on an 8th round, 9th round Alexander Madison now?
Yeah. No, and I actually made that mistake yesterday because I took I forgot who I took, but I didn't read the news before, and I had players in my queue, and I selected, and then that's when I jumped in the chat room and I started looking up news, and I'm like, oh crap! And literally, Alexander Madison won the next pick to Joe.
Well, but how often do we see that happen, right? Like when you're in these slow drafts all the time, this is the argument for taking your full 8 hours in the slow draft that some people make is, the news flow could change something tremendously. Like you could, I mean, if you, again, like the Austin Eckler thing, Scott Fishbowl's a slow draft. It just happened to be that I was on the clock when the Melvin Gordon was considering sitting out news kind of broke last year. And I was able to draft Eckler, at a much later spot than everybody else was able to get him the rest of the week or the 2 weeks after that news came out and everything was going on there. So things like this can definitely change and definitely help you out. And I wanted to have Armando on here to kind of talk a little bit about it and kind of go through it. So we gave you guys some of the examples in the past of where these guys, the backups, have wound up being 3rd round picks. We gave you examples of where the starter wound up dropping 5 or 6 spots lower than he should have been drafted. So I really can't tell you how this is going to play out, guys. I don't know if Dalvin Cook's going to sit or not. I don't know if Alexander Madison's going to wind up stepping in and taking that role. I can say getting Dalvin Cook at the end of the 1st round, if it works out like Ezekiel Elliott did last year and he winds up playing, you're going to be getting a steal, and those are going to be some of your better teams where you were able to, take Cook as one of the 2 running backs there towards the turn. At the same point in time, Austin Eckler was a guy who, in my opinion, won me a lot of my leagues last year and pushed me up high in them because he had a really, really good first half of the season there. And he did it at a low ADP where you got him very likely 5th, 6th, 7th rounds. If you were drafting real early in the season, you might have even gotten him 8th, 9th, 10th round or so. But he definitely outperformed his ADP. So here's the last thing I will say for anybody who's wondering, how much should we worry about Dalvin Cook being able to play or not to play. Minnesota opened as the 2nd favorite to win the NFC North this year. They were at plus 140 behind Green Bay, who was actually at plus 135. Just with this news yesterday, they already moved from plus 140 to plus 150. Now, I got to be honest, I expect that. I don't think that that's a crazy move. You would expect that the news that Dalvin Cook could sit out would move the line a little bit there. So seeing them move 10 points to 10 basis points to win a division, I don't really think that's crazy. So does that give you any indication, Armando, if of at least at this stage, the way that bettors, handicappers, the sports books are kind of looking at Dalvin Cook? Because I would think if they really thought Dalvin Cook wasn't going to play this year, that number would have moved more than 10 cents.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. I think they're just doing the precautionary, move just to move the needle a little bit. But I agree with you 100%, man. If they really felt that there was a strong chance that this was going to occur, then they'd move it much more. You see, I think that's a really good way to gauge it too. I think we're all on the same page. This is just way too early to tell. Way too early to tell. Vegas is, slightly concerned, but not overly concerned. I feel the same way. I guarantee you, if this situation's still going on, in a month from now, that number is going to be much different than it is today. I mean, we could do a show a month from now, and we'll talk these numbers once again. And if the Cook situation remains the same, and I guarantee you, it'll move much more than the 10 cents.
All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna put down a little bit of a chart here, right? So as of 2 days ago, Dalvin Cook was going ADP about 4.5.
Yeah.
You're in a draft today with the news that we have. What number does Dalvin Cook get to before you say, no, I can't not draft this guy? Is it 7? Is it 8? Is it 10 in the first round? Is it, if he's available at the beginning of the second round, you jump on him? Where's the spot where you say, I don't care, I'll take the risk, put Dalvin Cook on my roster?
6 or 7. I'm not dropping him that much yet. 6 or 7.
I would kind of agree with you. I think the best case that I could make is 8. If you drop him 8, I look at it as 8 or 9, because if you told me that you were moving, again, you even have Kamara ahead of him right now. I have the two of them as close, but I have Cook slightly ahead. But if you told me you were taking Alvin Kamara ahead of him, no argument for me. If you told me you were taking Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, I would probably be like, given the circumstances, if you just don't want to deal with the potential headache, I understand it. I don't know if I could go beyond that. Michael Thomas, probably. I think I would still take him ahead of guys like Miles Sanders, Nick Chubb, Kenyon Drake, like all those guys that are going at the back end of the first round, the turn right now. I still think I would rather have Dalvin Cook than any of those guys. So for me, if Dalvin Cook is available around like 8 or 9, that's probably about as far as I would let him drop. Now, let's go to the flip side of this coin. Alexander Mattison was round 11. What round now do you have to say, I think I got to start looking at Alexander Mattison? And without any more news, I'm not saying, we know Dalvin Cook is out, and now he's going to jump to the third. We'll ask that question next. But without getting any more news on Cook, how high do you think this – where does Mattison have to be where you start saying, I can't let this guy slide anymore?
I think this would be really dependent on my roster construction, but I'd say as early as the 7th. Man, this is really dependent on roster construction. I'd say 7th round is probably the earliest I take. I'm not going to jump in on Madison in the 5th round, even if it would become value eventually. If he does become a 3rd round pick, it's value in the 5th. But it's still too early for me to, jump the gun. There's still pretty good talent and pretty good players that are going to be productive in that 5th round. So I'd say 7th round. If I'm a Cook owner, 100% 7th round. If I'm not a Cook owner, 7th, 8th round. He's gonna start going in the 8th round as soon as today. I mean, that's just it. It is what it is. He's gonna start going in the 8th round as soon as today. So 7th round, I think, is fair. 6 is a bit too soon for me, man. But again, it really depends. If I'm at the back end of the 6th, I might consider it. It depends on the dynamics of the draft, to be honest with you.
So here's basically the guys that are going in the range that we're talking about here with Armando saying, the 7th up to the 7th-round pick, you'd be looking at guys around like pick 80 to pick 100. That's the range that he's going in right now. So you have – I'm just looking at the ADP for the NFFC right here, the National Fantasy Football Championship. Marlon Mack going 78, but he's been dropping, so he's probably in the 80s right now. Darius Geis at 86, Ronald Jones at 88, Kerryon Johnson at 93, James White at 96, Sony Michel at 97, Philip Lindsay at 103. So even without having any information, that's now the group of guys that I would say Alexander Mattison is kind of hanging out in at the moment. Now, here's the flip side of this question. Let's say Dalvin Cook comes on Twitter, F you, F you, F you, I'm not playing this year and I'm out. Now where does Alexander Mattison
go? I think he'd be going. So, all right. So if you look at the running backs going in that 3rd and 4th round. So you got guys like Chris Carson, Le'Veon Bell, James Conner, Devin Singletary, David Johnson. And this is a best ball 10 ADP. All right. Now the season long redraft. So DeAndre Swift, Mark Ingram, David Montgomery, Raheem Mostert. I think he's in that range, in that end of the 3rd, early 4th range. I really do think he'd be in that tier, with upside to jump to that next tier, because we've seen it, before. He didn't have a ton of carries as a rookie. I think it was 100. Yeah, 100, but he averaged 4.6 yards per attempt. Man, he was very explosive and really was, I thought, was really efficient. So I put him in that end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th, range.
Let me ask you this, because I mean, you've had a couple drafts already this year. We've talked about this. There's that big group of running backs that pretty much ends with, I'm going to say, Josh Jacobs, somewhere around like the 15th to 18th pick. And then there's a little bit of a lull there. And then you get into the only 3 or 4 guys that are ahead of the group that we're talking about that starts with like Singletary and Le'Veon Bell and Chris Carson and all those guys. The only guys that are really ahead of them in ADP are the old men that we talked about in Leonard Fournette, Todd Gurley, and Melvin Gordon. So let's say Dalvin Cook happens to be out right now. Do you still take old man Lenny, Todd Gurley, and Melvin Gordon ahead of Vikings rush game leading Alexander Mattison?
I am going to be 100% in the minority in this, like 100%. I would not. I'm fading Leonard Fournette. I'm fading Melvin Gordon, and Todd Gurley. I wrote about them last week, and of running backs that I really, with red flags. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think all but Todd Gurley was featured in that article. But I agree with you. I that bunch right there, Chris Carson, you could toss him in there as well. That bunch of running backs, for me, I'm just trying to stay away from if I can. So I would skip in that tier of running backs and then take the Mattison later, and I'd be very happy about it, assuming he is 100% starting and Cook is not playing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where he's ultimately going to wind up at the end. If we get news that Dalvin Cook is out, I think he winds up around where we had Austin Eckler last year, around the, round 4 pick or so, depending on, round 3 when it got really down to it and you knew he was starting, which is why there's value there. Like we said, there's value drafting Cook at the end of the 1st round if you can get him, assuming he plays or hoping that he plays. There's value getting Alexander Mattison right now in the 7th, 8th, 9th round when he really should be in the 4th round. So that's kind of where we're at right now and, how everything's going to go. Anything else you want to add here about the Dalvin Cook saga before we sign off?
No, the only thing is, and again, I just want to make sure that everyone listening to this just understands, like, don't overreact to it, the news right away. Kind of wait it out, but be proactive. If you're drafting Dalvin Cook now, make sure you handcuff him with Alexander Mattison, and if you do that, you're gonna be just fine. I mean, you really are gonna be just fine because Mattison was already a priority handcuff if you're drafting Dalvin Cook. So just make sure you get to him before someone else does, and understand ADP right now is going to change on a daily basis for him. So make sure you're monitoring that every single day. I think that's very important. And that's it. I mean, don't overreact. Dalvin Cook should still be a first round top 7 pick.
Yep, and one of the things I love about what these guys are doing over at Fantasy Guru with the draft guide is, the draft guide's a living, breathing thing. Like Armando said, he was writing an article for it yesterday. There are articles going in there every day. There are updates that are happening. I don't know if the update has happened yet for the where these guys would be taking guys like Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison, but it will be happening soon, and I think you're going to be surprised. I don't think that you're going to see Cook drop very far on those lists. You probably will see Madison move up on those lists. I think this is actually news that pumps up Madison more than it really hurts Dalvin Cook, at least now at the moment. But we wanted to make sure we gave you guys a quick update on our thoughts on it, where we thought these things were going to wind up, and kind of give you guys the idea. Remember, this could be a Zeke situation. This could be a Melvin Gordon situation. This could be a Le'Veon Bell situation. We don't know how it's going to play out. All we can do is tell you guys how those guys were drafted in the last couple of years and how both them and their backups worked out when those things happened. What we do know is one way or another, there's going to be some value, whether it's Cook dropping and not creating the value, or Madison being drafted later on than he will be at the end if Cook winds up not playing. So one way or another, make sure you're keeping an eye on these Vikings things. Make sure you're keeping an eye on everything we're doing over here at Elite Fantasy and fantasyguru.com. And for Armando, this is Benny signing off for another episode of The Opening Line at EliteSportsBetting.com.